Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you can all join us again for our fourth presentation in the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute 2025 at the U Lecture Series. I'm Laura Peterson, an OLLI volunteer. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota is a vibrant learning community for people aged 50 plus. Part of the College of Continuing and Professional Studies, OLLI belongs to a national network of Osher Lifelong Learning Institutes supported by the Bernard Osher Foundation. I would like to acknowledge and say thank you to our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. We acknowledge that the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work, as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. Today's lecture is Understanding the Present Media Environment: Why Trust in the News Has Declined Around the World. Our presenter is Dr. Benjamin Toff. Dr. Toff received his bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard and his master's and doctoral degrees in political science from the University of Wisconsin. He is an associate professor in the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota and the director of the Minnesota Journalism Center. He is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Political Psychology and the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. Prior to entering academia, he worked as a journalist and researcher at the New York Times. The floor is yours, Dr. Toff.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the warm welcome. So I will present some information about a study, about a 3-year-long study that I did leading a project on trust in news. And it's a project that's continued in some form or another, but it was very concentrated 3 years. It started in 2020. And most of the data I'm going to present covers the 3 years of that project, which was focused on 4 different countries, but I'll give a little context as we get into it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with some slides. So a little bit of background about me. So as was mentioned, I am a faculty member at the School of Journalism, Mass Communication at the University of Minnesota. This project, though, did start at the University of Oxford at an institute called the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where I spent, as I said, 3 years as a senior research fellow, and before that, 1 year as a postdoc. The work itself that I do on this project is part of a broader research agenda I have, which is kind of spans political communication, journalism studies, and public opinion research. And a lot of this research that I do is very mixed methods. So as you'll see in what I'm going to present today, I'm drawing on a lot of survey data, but also a lot of qualitative research methods where we talk with people either one-on-one or in focus groups to try to kind of triangulate on some of the fairly complicated social phenomenon that we study. A lot of my work is rooted in the US, and I'm sure many of you have questions about the US context for declining trust in news. But I also find studying this in a comparative way where we're looking across countries can be really valuable. The US is quite unique in a lot of aspects of our own media environment, our own political environment. And so being able to put that alongside things that we're seeing elsewhere in the world, I think is a really valuable lens through which to understand these phenomena. Before I studied trust in news specifically, I worked on a project for many years on news avoidance. This is a book that I published last year called Avoiding the News, Reluctant Audiences for Journalism, which was focused on people who consume little to no news whatsoever. And it was similar in kind of the sort of approach that we took using a mix of both qualitative methods and survey data analysis. It has a lot to do with shaping some of the ways that we thought about interpreting what's going on in terms of trust in news, and there's certain overlap for sure in terms of news avoidance. but I just wanted to give you a little sense of background about where this project was coming from. So the core question that we're focused on in this research is, why is trust in news declining? And we do that through both an international and public-centered perspective. And I'll say a little bit more about each of those as we get into it. But as many people know and probably are familiar with, trust in the news media in the US has been declining for many, many decades. This is a question that the Gallup organization, the public opinion research firm, has been asking since the 1970s. And you can see the percentage of people in America who had a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the mass media has been declining from over 70% or so back in the 1970s to less than a third today. And every couple of years or so, they update these numbers, and the trend just seems to be continuing this kind of slow decline in trust. So we have that dynamic, and then the Reuters Institute, where I was working on this project, one of the core research studies that they do every year is called the Digital News Report. It's a survey of news audiences around the world. These days, it's about 46 different markets globally. And they ask a slightly different version of a trust in news question, but they ask, think about news in general, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? I think you can trust most news most of the time. And you'll see the US is down there at the bottom, or close to the bottom, at 26% who agree with that statement. And so there's quite a lot of variation. You can see in countries in Scandinavia, for example, it's closer to 70% in Finland. In Portugal, 61%. And so there is this significant variation in terms of attitudes about trust across the world, but we're also seeing similar declines in many places. So this is using that digital news report data, looking between 2015 and 2019, you see in some cases double-digit declines in places like Brazil, France, Germany, and the UK. As well as in a country like Finland, you also see declines there as well. So we're seeing these patterns play out in many places around the world, not just in the US, where we're seeing that pretty steady decline going back to the 1970s. So, part of our goal in this project was to look at in an international way to better understand what may be contributing to these trends. The other piece of the project was this public-centered perspective. And what we mean by that is putting the public at the center of the study rather than being led by how either academics or journalists think about this phenomenon of trust in news. And not that what academics have to say on the subject or what journalists have to say on the subject are not important, but a lot of the ways in which this has been studied in the past has been pretty focused on the ways that we as academics or as journalists tend to think about the value of journalism itself. And so we were very deliberate in trying to conduct this study in a very inductive way, in a very iterative way, trying to hear what we could from audiences in these different countries, and not necessarily pass judgment on the way that they're thinking about news, but try to understand what it is that they mean by news, how it is that they're thinking about this concept of trust, how it is that they're thinking about news media in general, or the larger media environment. So the project itself, I should say, we received, the Reuters Institute, I should say, received a grant from then called the Facebook Journalism Project, which funded this research, although I will say they had no involvement in shaping any of the actual research we did, but they did provide the funding for this. And as one of the pieces of the project was looking at was trying to understand the role of digital platforms, and so get to in a little bit farther into the presentation, digital platforms are an important part of the story around why we're seeing declines around the world. So it was a 3-year project. I got to work with a team of other researchers in leading this work, but their core questions were these 3: trying to understand how to better define trust in news, so trying to get a better handle on what we even mean by the concept, understand why it was declining, And then also try to look at some of the things that could be done to try to reverse some of those trends. So the presentation today, I'm going to focus on these four areas. I'll spend a little bit of time first starting with defining what we mean by trust. Then I'll talk a little bit more about how we studied it, how we went about studying it in this project. I'll then provide an overview of some of the key findings, the key takeaways from the work itself. And then I'll discuss a little bit at the end around implications and next steps in this research. And we should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So when we define trust in news, it really requires specifying two core pieces of this. What do we mean by trust, and what do we mean by news? And neither piece of this equation are particularly straightforward. Operationalizing trust in news in surveys, which is the way that this has normally been done. I showed you earlier that measure from Gallup, the way that they've asked about this. In general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as newspapers, TV, and radio, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly? The Digital News Report from the Reuters Institute asks the question this way: thinking about news in general, do you agree or disagree with the following statements? I think you can trust most news most of the time. And these measures are helpful in that you can track responses to them over time, but that doesn't really give you a whole lot of nuance around understanding how people understand the concept of trust that you're even asking about. In our project, we often use a slightly different version of this question. We rely on some other academic work that has really tried to standardize the way that academics ask about and study this phenomenon. And so they put a little bit more emphasis on trust in the information from the news media in a given country. And so that we have in some of our data measures like that. But we've also tried to very deliberately collect other kinds of data, as I was saying, not just survey data, where we can understand the ways that the public are thinking about what this concept of trust really means to them. Theoretically, there's a great deal of both philosophical work and conceptual work trying to understand this phenomenon of trust. And at its core, often what is an important piece of the equation is this notion of a willingness to be vulnerable. So trust is a leap of faith. And so in the context of news, we're often talking about a willingness to be vulnerable to being misled, to being misinformed, to being manipulated in some way or another by sources of information in the news media. Trust requires that willingness to be vulnerable in that way. What that doesn't really tell you, though, is what that is based on. So what is the source of that trust, or what is the foundation of that trust? And there are a lot of different theories about what drives it, and we know some of this from psychological research around what tends to build trust in other contexts, interpersonal trust, for example, trust towards commercial companies, and it's not one thing. There's a lot of sort of intertwined factors that tend to shape trust. It's both cognitive evaluations about how people think about the accuracy of the information that they tend to see. There's a strong affective or emotional component to whether people feel like something is trustworthy or not. There's a strong relational aspect to it. There's a social connection that people feel with, particularly for interpersonal trust and the level of familiarity or relational connection that people feel, as well as cultural factors that shape whether people are more or less trusting in general, both interpersonally and towards organizations. So in the context of trust in news, we often think about multiple dimensions of trust. People's attitudes about news media are shaped not only from their own experiences using news, which may be an important contributor in terms of the way that people use those cognitive evaluations, whether news is accurate, whether it confirms their pre-existing view of the way the world works, as well as how they feel when they consume it, all of those other dimensions of trust I was talking about, but from those direct experiences using and engaging with news. That's combined with their preconceptions about news. So ideas that people have in their minds around the role that news should play in society, and why. And third, there is a strong role that is played by cues and messages from elites. So ideas that people have around what it is that journalists do, that is shaped both by claims and messages that you may hear from politicians, but also people in your own lives, people that you trust individually, whether they're close friends or family, teachers, other social influences. These cues that people take around what is trustworthy and what is not a trustworthy source are really powerful factors that combine with and are intertwined with the direct experiences that people have using news. Now, so that's gives you a sense of how we're thinking about trust, which is maybe more expansive than you might be thinking about it previously. The other part of the equation is what we mean by news, which is no less complicated, particularly in our current media environment. And so there has been some work to try to differentiate between different levels or objects of trust when it comes to this phenomenon of trust in news. And when I showed you before those survey measures that are often used to measure how much or how little trust people have, they're often asked about at the general level. So trust in news media in general or mass media in general. And that is one, I think, important object of trust for measuring trust in news. But of course, you can have other types of trust. You can have other types of objects of trust where you can be more or less trusting of an individual piece of news content, so an individual article or segment on the radio. You have more or less trust towards individual journalists. Obviously, a lot of people who engage regularly with news have very specific organizations that they trust or distrust. So whether you feel like you can trust news media in general, that may be quite different from the way you think about whether you can trust Fox News versus MSNBC in the context of the US. People who consume a lot of news often have very distinct levels of trust towards different organizations, or even different modes of media, whether you trust news on social media differently than you trust print news versus television news or cable news. People can have these various attitudes in terms of the different objects of trust we may be describing. And so in our work, we try to focus not just on news media in general, but this concept of selective trust. Trying to move beyond the notion that high trust in news is always a good thing or low trust in news is always a bad thing, but try to understand in a more in-depth manner, what does this mean in terms of selective trust? As I was saying before, people may have differing levels of trust towards different organizations in an environment. And I think normatively, that's what we hope people to have. We don't necessarily want people to be all trusting of all sources of news or distrusting of all sources of news. You really want people to be selective in what they trust, and having that selective trust on the basis of things that we think are normally, sophisticated rationales or worthwhile rationales. And so we're trying to understand what sources or what factors are driving that selective trust versus just trust in news in general. Now, I should say there is a growing amount of research that's also looking at other phenomena, like generalized trust towards all news media, which we often think of as in the sense of a sort of gullibility to conspiracy theories, or generalized distrust, which is there's a growing amount of research that suggests that particularly in a digital media environment in which people feel inundated with information from a lot of different sources, have a difficult time differentiating between what is trustworthy and what's not, that a fair number of people have taken a kind of I just need to be distrusting of everything attitude as a kind of smart way to navigate the environment. And so you do have people who are neither selectively trusting individual sources, but are actually trusting almost everything or trusting almost nothing, both of which I think are normatively undesirable as far as how one can navigate the information environment. It doesn't quite tell you what basis they're using to differentiate between what is a trustworthy and what's an untrustworthy source. And as I'll get to in a minute, part of what we found is there are quite a lot of people who are actually at those ends, who aren't necessarily selectively making determinations about what sources are trustworthy. They are thinking about news media in general. All right, so I kind of previewed a little bit about how we went about studying this phenomenon. But our project, over the 3 years of the project and beyond, we really focus on 4 countries in particular. So the United States is one of the 4, but Brazil, the United Kingdom, and India are the other 3. And the idea was to have a wider range of countries beyond just the single country, but not so many countries like the 46 in the digital news report, that it made it challenging to really focus in depth on the importance of the context in that environment, both the political environment and the media environment. The other commonality between a lot of these countries is, practically speaking, much of the work could be conducted in English. Of course, in India, there are a wide range of languages spoken, but English is commonly used as well, given its colonial history. Brazil, of course, is the exception, where we had a member of the team who was Brazilian and a native speaker Portuguese who could help us with translating and conducting a lot of the qualitative work. So we, in addition to this comparative aspect of the project, we also collected, as I said, a lot of different kinds of data. So we had a mix of in-depth interviews and focus groups, representative surveys in all 4 countries. We did a study in Brazil where we were tracking using what's called digital trace data, where we were tracking the websites that people went to on a regular basis, combined with survey data, so we could understand not just what people said that they consume, but also a behavioral measure of what websites they visited in relation to what they said they trusted or distrusted. And we did a couple of experiments as well, looking at kind of different approaches to intervening. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the experiments we've been doing since then, towards the end of the talk. And we published in a kind of iterative way. So we started the project actually, although much of our project focused on audiences and the public, we actually started by interviewing journalists and newsroom managers in each of the 4 countries. That helped inform the in-depth interviews and focus groups that we did in the next stage of the project, which then informed the surveys we collected. And then we went back to newsroom managers and journalists in the late part of 2021. That then informed our next data collection around qualitative data and so on and so forth. And so we used what we were learning from one stage of the data collection to inform the next stage in this very iterative process. We're currently working on a book to try to pull all of this research together, but all of the reports are available online at the Reuters Institute website. I didn't do all of this alone, I should say. So I worked with a really fantastic team of other researchers at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, some who are, as I said, native Portuguese speaker from Brazil, 2 other academics who are originally from India, who had familiarity with the continent there. And so it really was a team effort in many different ways. So I want to acknowledge all of their contributions to the project as well. All right, so much of what I'm going to focus on in the remainder of the talk are the findings. And I'm going to highlight sort of at a high level several of the most important key takeaways from the work. And I'll go through each of them one by one in a little bit more detail. But I'll start with one of the, I think, most important findings, which is really what we argue that may be counter to the way a lot of people are thinking about. When they see the declining levels of trust, you see lots of examples of people who are very hostile to news and journalism. We think about this growing segment of the public who have very strong views about the news media. But there's a larger segment of the public, we argue, that is mostly indifferent towards news and journalism, and that's what's fueling a lot of the declining levels of trust. As I said, we started the project by interviewing journalists in all 4 countries, and then the next stage of the project, we started to interview audiences. And at a very general level, thinking about the way that they conceptualize what trust is and why they thought why journalists thought the public was trusting or distrusting, and vice versa. So one of the things we started to hear was not that people were sort of talking past each other in a totally different way, but that in terms of emphasis, journalists and newsrooms, they tended to think about this in a somewhat different way than audiences. It's somewhat more focus on things that were more central to the journalism practices that go into the creation of news. So their editorial judgment, the ways in which they were transparent about their processes, about how news was made, how they chose which sources to interview, the degree to which they represented certain perspectives in their coverage or not. And it's not that these things did not matter. It's just that when you talk to audiences about what they thought was important for determining what they could trust or distrust, audiences tend to focus on much more observable aspects of the news. So whether they recognized and were familiar with the brand, whether they felt like the coverage responded to things that were relevant in everyday life, whether they had a sense of the history or heritage of that brand, and things having to do with the presentation style, the language or appearance of news. So, on television, whether they liked the graphics and the visuals or the tone of voice of the presenter, these things that were much more at its core about what you liked and disliked about news. And it's not that journalists didn't think those things were important. It's just that the journalists tended not to focus as much on those things. They tended to focus much more on daily journalism practice and their editorial decision making. And the truth is, much of that happens kind of behind the scenes. Most audiences don't have access to a lot of that. And so it makes sense that audiences were somewhat less focused on those aspects of news production. So I'll give you some examples from the qualitative interviews we did with members of the public in the 4 countries. Andrew in the UK, and I should say these are all pseudonyms, said it was essentially an instinctual feeling. It's hard to put into words because it's very instinctual. I don't really think about it. I just have a general feeling, really. I suppose I just trust if it comes from a major publication that I recognize. If it's some random page I have no idea about, they rarely come up, but it's more questionable. Deborah, also in the UK, as daft a reason as it sounds, I always remember my granddad saying he would only trust the BBC, and I guess I grew up conditioned to think that. Or Pooja in India, a lot of it has to do with language as well. When I see something that has been written well grammatically and otherwise, that does lead you to trust it because you can see that the person who's written it obviously has studied a lot, has studied the language, has a good command of the language. So you can see in these examples, people are drawing on their sense of familiarity, their sense of the sort of presentation style or the language that's been used. In India, there was much more of a focus on language than the other countries. But in all cases, there was much more of a attention to the presentational aspects of news than the editorial policies and procedures of individual newsrooms. Now, part of what we think is going on here is I think we sometimes underappreciate just how much many people aren't necessarily thinking in terms of selective trust. They're thinking about news in general, and they're not necessarily differentiating a whole lot between individual news organizations. Many people saw a lot of news as largely interchangeable. So Henry in the US, I'm like a hoverer where I want to know what's going on, but I just don't have the time to be counterpoint of each issue. Or Kavita in India, I'm not in favor of any in particular. The news is important, medium is not important. So a lot of people had this sense of whether they could trust news was at that level of news in general rather than individual sources, in part because they just didn't really know how to differentiate between them, or they didn't spend a lot of time thinking about individual differences across the environment. So in some of our survey work, we tried to figure out how much of the public was doing this selective trusting. And so we asked people a list of 15 different news organizations in each of the 4 countries, and to what degree they were trusting towards each of those individual outlets. And then we segmented each of the 4 countries by the people that we saw as generally trusting of most or generally untrusting of most. And that group in the middle is selectively trusting. And you can see at the end there, the percentage of people who are trusting of no brands at all of the 15, or trusting of all of them. And you can see in India, for example, 17% of people were trusting of all 15 of those organizations we asked about, versus 12% in the US who didn't trust any of the 15 brands we asked about. So those are the sort of most extreme examples within the data. There was, of course, a large segment, the largest segment of people were in the middle, who were trusting of some but not others. And we tried to look at some of the patterns that explain these differences across countries. We focused specifically in one of our reports on that generally untrusting categories, the people who were tended to not trust any of the news organizations, or very few, below average number of the organizations in their country. And we did see some patterns across all 4 countries in terms of who was in that generally untrusting segment of the public. So across the 4 countries, they did tend to be older. They tended to be more likely to be male than female. And they tended to be less likely to be college educated in all 4 countries. There were some urban-rural differences, but only in the US and the UK, where people who were in this generally untrusting category tended to be more likely to be in smaller towns or rural areas. But we didn't see that geographic dynamic or geographic breakdown in Brazil or India. And so as you're thinking, you see this description of people, you can thinking in the US context, this probably also aligns with the way you think about some of the most vocal ideological critics of news. However, these individuals also tend to be less interested in politics altogether. They were less engaged or knowledgeable about how news is made, and they were less interested in knowing how news is made. So they were just more disengaged. That's why we describe them as more indifferent towards news than necessarily hostile critics. So that was the first key finding that came out of our study. It's just the importance of that indifference in driving some of these declines across countries. I started to allude to the second major finding, which was that distrust is yes, intertwined with politics, but that it's not purely all about polarization, which we focus a lot on in the US, in part because the US is particularly politically polarized compared to these other 4 countries, or the 3 countries, I should say. So there's a fair amount of work that looks at the relationship between trust in news and trust in other institutions in society. And the term that's sometimes used to describe this is the trust nexus. Attitudes towards government and other elite institutions are a major predictor of whether people are trusting of news. And we do see this in the US as well. So trust in the press is quite low here, almost as low as trust in the national government. This is from 2021, so about 4 years ago. But we did see, a strong correlation between trust in the news media, trust in the press, and trust in other institutions in society. And we know from the other research that there is this strong connection across the world where trust in news has been declining, but so has trust in other institutions. However, US audiences were particularly polarized along partisan ideological lines in ways that we saw to much smaller degrees in other places, and not necessarily in the same direction. So you see, when we divide up the sample in terms of trust and information from the news media in the 4 countries by how favorable or unfavorable people felt towards the leader of that country at that time. So Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India, Boris Johnson at the time was prime minister in the UK, and Joe Biden was, of course, president in the US. You do see this wide gap. So 85% of people who held a favorable view towards Joe Biden in the US was trusting of the news media in the US, versus 31% of Americans who held a unfavorable view towards Joe Biden. They were overwhelmingly not trusting of news in the US. And we saw a smaller version of that gap in the UK, for example, and even smaller versions of that gap in India or Brazil. However, in India, the trust in the political leader, so trust in Modi, was a stronger predictor of trust in the news media. So people were more trusting of news who were more trusting of Modi. The opposite of that dynamic in Brazil. So there's definitely a relationship in terms of how people think about their political leaders and their political system, but it's not always the same by country, and it's not nearly to the same degree of the polarization that we see in this country elsewhere in the world. And so what we argue is there's an underappreciated divide that's based not just on polarization, but based on the degree to which people feel involved in politics or engaged in politics and political life. There's a larger group that is disengaged altogether, who are less interested in politics, who are driving some of the decreases in trust. So what I'm showing you here is a separate question we asked about trust in news media on different digital platforms, divided by people's level of interest in politics in the UK and in the US in particular. You see this pretty consistent gap across all of these platforms, where people who are more interested in politics tended to be more trusting of news, less interested in politics, less trusting of news across all these different digital platforms. We also heard this in our qualitative data collection. So people would say things like Barbara in Brazil, with regards to news, I don't usually consume it online or on TV. I'm a bit disconnected from this world, especially if it is politics. I don't trust anything that is about politics. And so people were making this distinction between trust in news in general, but trust in news, especially when it covers politics. And we actually asked a survey question trying to get at this. So separately asking, generally speaking, to what extent do you trust or not trust information from the news media in your country when they cover politics, separate from a question about news media in general. And in all 4 countries, we saw this gap where people were more trusting of news in general than they were about news when it covers politics. So people were sort of on guard, especially when it came to political topics. And again, what was interesting was we saw where the countries were less polarized in terms of attitudes towards the political leader, Brazil and India, this gap in terms of political engagement was even larger. So that was the second major finding about the importance of distrust being intertwined with politics in a different way that wasn't just purely about polarization, but about attitudes about interest in political, in engaging in political life. The third major finding had to do with media structures. And so I kind of alluded to this already in terms of the role of digital platforms. But this is a major factor in terms of understanding what's driving declines in trust in news, but in somewhat different ways for different platforms. So earlier this year, with my colleagues from the Trust in News Project, as well as other colleagues from the Reuters Institute, we published an article in the Journal of Communication looking at over time changes in trust in news across all 46 countries that are part of the Digital News Report. And we were trying to understand what might be explaining when you controlled for a lot of other factors at the individual level and at the country level in terms of the changes that occurred over a number of years, what might explain declines in trust. And so we were looking at data from 2015 to 2023 across these 46 different markets and looking at what might explain the trends. And we did see, first of all, there was a significant decline across these countries, although there was some countries in which the effect of an individual, there's actually increases in trust happening in some places. So it isn't purely a declining trend, and nor is it a consistent trend every single year. And so that figure at the bottom there of B, this is just looking at if allowing the changes year by year to be expressed in the data. You do see this sort of increase in 2021, corresponds, of course, to the COVID-19 pandemic, where there was a surge of interest in news and engagement with news because of the pandemic, but then a steady return to the same pattern we're seeing in general. The plot on the right is the breakdown by country. And so you can see some countries where there has actually been, over time, some increases in trust, But overall, there has been this steady decline across many of these different places. And so you can see the US is sort of 2/3 down, where there is a significant decrease in trust over time, but not as large of a decrease as we've seen in some other countries like Brazil down there at the bottom, as well as the UK. All right, so one of the things we found by analyzing the data in this way and controlling for a lot of other country level and individual level factors is these two trends. So declining use of broadcast television was associated with declines in trusted news, whereas increasing use of digital sources for news, especially social media, was also associated with declines in trusted news. And so we do think that there's an important structural changes are at the core of how people are using media, how they're engaging with news, how they're paying attention to news, that's linked to these declines in trust across many different places around the world. And so what we're finding essentially is as there's an increase in television news use in a given year compared to the country average, there's an increase in trust that corresponds in the reverse manner to social media use. So the declining use of social media, for example, would be associated with increases in trust. Of course, the actual trends that we're seeing around the world are the reverse of it. So, more and more places there's increases in the level of use of social media to access news, which is corresponding to a decline in trust, and declining use of broadcast television for news, corresponding to a decline in trust as well. And so when we model this in statistical analysis, even controlling for other factors, we find this significant pattern playing out. And so that leads to a lot of questions, though. So we see this pattern, but what's the reason? How do digital platforms relate to these declining patterns of trusted news? So we heard different concerns from the journalists. We heard different concerns expressed by individuals when we talked to them. And one of the concerns is this one, that platforms actually tend to incentivize forms of less trustworthy news. And so this is something that we heard a number of journalists describe, feeling like the professional practices of their industry are being shaped by the incentives on these platforms. So a tendency towards more clickbait, a tendency towards more commentary, a tendency towards more negative coverage, more polarizing content, that these things tend to get the most attention on the platforms, get most rewarded on the platforms. And so they're proliferating this sorts of content on the platforms, which may not necessarily be the sorts of things that build trust and may actually be the sorts of content that actually undermine trust. So that's concern number one. The second concern about the platforms is that they're actually amplifying critical discourses about news. So not only are people maybe encountering this kind of news that may be particularly less trustworthy, they're also encountering a lot of criticism about news from all quarters. So they're not only encountering, maybe the least trustworthy news, but a lot of discussion, a lot of debate, a lot of criticism about journalism everywhere they look. One of the editors of the Philadelphia Inquirer told us in an interview we did, he talked about just how toxic Twitter in particular was, but also Facebook and in the United States. It's this constant source of attack, both on the institution, but also on a personal level for their own journalists. And so a lot of journalists talked about the ways in which the corrosive environment of the platforms themselves were potentially contributing to people's attitudes about what journalism is and what value it has. We also see this in our survey data. So people who are regular users of digital platforms to access news also said they were more likely to be seeing or hearing people criticizing journalists and the news media more frequently. And we saw this across all platforms, particularly Twitter. You see the largest gap there, but the same dynamic playing out in some form or another for all platform users. The third concern is that platforms undermine brands' connection to their audience. So individual news organizations have a harder time developing a relationship with their audience when they're encountering publics through those intermediaries. And so there's been some experiments, both by some colleagues at the Reuters Institute as well as at the Pew Research Center, that look at when people encounter news in these digital spaces, how well are they able to recall the actual source of that information, the brand name itself. And typically people have a hard time remembering. And so it's contributing to a sense that like sort of news is news, and we're not necessarily going to be as likely to differentiate between those sources. And this is a real challenge for news organizations. And so one of the studies that we conducted, we were actually having people walk us through their experience of engaging with news in digital spaces, whether it was Facebook or WhatsApp or Google. And we were trying to pay attention to what kinds of cues are they using to make judgments about what is trustworthy and what's not. And often what they are drawing on are essentially shortcuts, what we call shortcuts to trust. The brand name is an important one, especially important when people recognize the brand name. But they're also paying a lot of attention to things like the visuals, the images, the headlines, the tone of the word choices, the social cues, so seeing who shared that post or what the comments might be suggesting about it, platform cues, like how many likes or shares that the content has. All of these kinds of cues are useful heuristics that people are drawing on to make sense of what's trustworthy and what's not. Again, going back to what I talked about at the beginning, a lot of this is not necessarily about the underlying journalism being done, but it's about the kind of observable characteristics that people have to go on as they're making like split-second decisions about what to pay attention to in these digital spaces. And so all of that is, I think, reinforcing the different ways in which platforms are a core factor in driving some of these declines. Fourth thing is fundamentally, when we really talk to people about what they're looking for, what they want from news, there's a lot of consensus, despite how often polarized people are. Most people at the end of the day say they want impartial, accurate, relevant journalism relevant to their lives. Where they differ is in their perceptions about how to achieve it, about what that actually means in practice. And so there is an aspect of this, in addition to all the other factors we've talked about, the political environment, the media environment, the digital platforms. There's an aspect of this that has to do with our pluralistic information environment. We just live in a different world in which people are accessing information from more sources than ever before. And to some degree, that's a good thing. There are people who argue that some of the declining trust that we're seeing around the world is a product of the fact that we have fewer gatekeepers. We don't live in a world in which, we have 3 news broadcasters who are the only sources of information. And although that makes it easier to navigate, we should not romanticize what that was like. There were a lot of people's perspectives that were left out from the news when it was that simplified. And so part of this, I do think, is a broadening of the information environment, which is a healthy thing. And there are aspects of this that, some have argued are a byproduct of that pluralistic environment. In the last year of the project, we convened a number of focus groups around the world, focusing on marginalized, chronically underserved audiences. So in the US in particular, we were gathering groups focused on race and place. So we had groups that were largely people who identified as Black, as well as people who lived in rural communities, separate groups. In Brazil, we convened a number of groups of Black participants, both in the North and in the South. In the UK, we focused on working class participants, so groups that were selected on the basis of socioeconomic class. And in India, we convened groups that were focused around caste and religion, so people from scheduled castes and tribes, as well as Muslim participants. And the idea was to understand perspectives that are harder to draw out in survey data and also harder to draw out in the qualitative data we had done at that up to that point, in part because if you don't deliberately try to recruit people and screen for people from these communities, you just don't have enough of them in your samples to really focus in depth on their perspectives. So that was the rationale for why we focused the project in this way in the last year of the study. We also divided the groups by gender and age in most locations, in part practically, so that we could draw out some of these intersectional differences going on in each of these communities. But what we found were very similar kinds of frustrations across all of these different groups. Even though we have very different kinds of groups represented, we found a lot of common critiques and complaints about the news, particularly around questions of bias and stereotyping. So although people had a shared preference for impartial news, at its core, wanting to have accurate information, where people were concerned is they did not feel like much of the coverage was capturing that accurately. They were concerned about misleading images or events or people from their own communities in terms of the way they were represented. So in Brazil and the US, for example, there was a lot of concern about misrepresentation of their own community, of people as poor, criminal, violent, or hypersexualized. So Miriam, for example, in the US, the biggest issue I've always had with the media is that when there's a black man on trial for something, he's already in an orange suit. He's already been charged. The media is already criminalized. So people have these common concerns about their own communities being misrepresented or portrayed inaccurately. In the UK, misrepresentations of working class people, people were concerned about them being portrayed as lazy or freeloaders. So Nicholas in the UK, a lot of the reporting in the working class is struggling, for example, or ones that are on benefits. It's always, get up and find work. It's always treats them as lazy people. And at its core, what people were concerned about was not seeing their own lived experiences captured in the coverage, as well as the ways in which this perpetuation of stereotypes would actually be very harmful to people on a personal level. So it's one thing to be sort of abstractly concerned about this coverage. It's another thing to be concerned about the real harms that were happening in your own community as a result of that inaccuracy in the coverage. Another concern that people had were frustrations about news intentionally polarizing people. So sort of using the coverage of different groups to pit one group versus another. In India, for example, every news story is about Hindu Muslim, Hindu Muslim, Hindu Muslim. We don't feel like watching it at all. The real news won't come out unless this stops. Or Helena in Brazil, I think they help to have us divided instead of working to unite us. They set to divide us even more. So these common concerns about the coverage itself from groups that were marginalized, they weren't objecting to the notion of impartial news. They were objecting to the notion that what they were getting was actually accurate, was actually achieving that. All right, so I'm going to wrap up and talk a little bit about implications and next steps in this research, and then I'll turn it over to questions from those assembled today. So to sum up, I know I've thrown a lot of information at you, but essentially, there's not a single reason that trusted news is declining, but rather it's a mix of these 4 different areas that we've identified in our research: politics, professional practices, platforms, and pluralism. These 4 different pieces, a mix of political factors, the changing relationship between the news media and its audiences, new expectations that people have about representation in coverage, and rapid changes in the supply of news and the professional incentives around how journalists operate in these spaces. All of these things combine to be driving the declines that we're seeing around the world. Of course, many of these factors are outside of the control of individual news organizations. Some of them are things that journalists can do and can focus on doing better. But many of these things are broader headwinds and forces that are outside of their control, which I think is a major challenge when it comes to knowing how to respond. We do think, part of the story involves being aware of how news appears in these digital spaces and sort of working within those constraints, just as it involves working within the constraints of people's broader understanding of institutions. But there are things that I think can be done. And so that's really the focus of my work since then, has been trying to work with news organizations around developing interventions that might be able to respond to some of these concerns within those constraints. And more of this work has been focused on the US. And so I've been working with a number of organizations, including the nonprofit news outlet, the Texas Tribune, over the last year. on experimenting with new forms of outreach and engagement to try to build trust with audiences that they otherwise have struggled to reach. One of the things we've done is try to study. The Texas Tribune has really been a leader in using live journalism events to try to engage with the public. And so we've done some survey research on the participants who've gone out to events from the communities. They've done events around the state of Texas to try to help them better understand who they're reaching this way and try to strategize about how they can partner with different organizations to try to reach people they're not currently reaching. Now, one of the things we found so far in this work is that there's a very strong social component to event attendance. About 35% of people attended the events that they attended with another person. So thinking about particularly reaching that indifferent audience for news, who are probably the least likely to come out to an event led by a news organization, are there ways of trying to engage with people who are otherwise indifferent, but through a social action, a social factor around what that in-person event looks like? So that's one of the areas that we're working on together. A second area involves using text messaging to connect with audiences in a two-way conversation rather than just relying on the typical digital platforms to reach people where they are. And so we did an experiment where we recruited a set of Texans who were distrusting of news in general, who did not consume news regularly relative to an average person. And we invited them to participate in a text conversation over the course of the around the election and several weeks after Election Day, where they could ask questions of the newsroom, they could get responses about anything that was on their mind, whether it was concern over the tallying of votes or why they covered a story in a particular way. And having this kind of two-way conversation, having access to the newsroom in this way was a significant, did actually increase trust among the participants in that group relative to a control group that wasn't invited to participate, but was surveyed at the same before and after period. We've also worked with the Chicago Sun-Times, which has been trying to engage with people in using text messages as well, both over the course of the convention. They used a texting initiative to engage with younger audiences who were trying to follow election news that way, as well as these days they've been partnering with a company called Medan, which has a automated platform for engaging on WhatsApp to respond to concerns of the migrant community in Chicago, and surfacing content responses that are trying to answer questions that people have about what's happening given the policies of the Trump administration. And so looking at whether these are technologies that can be useful for engaging with audiences in a way that are, again, less dependent on the current digital platforms, which may not incentivize the forms of coverage that are most likely to build trust. The second area where we've done some experimentation is again around news mode or delivering news in different ways. So we've been looking at, for example, building brand loyalty and trust with younger audiences through targeted engagement on digital platforms like TikTok and Instagram, which are so widely used among younger audiences. And so we did a experiment working with Minnesota Public Radio. They have an initiative called Reverb, where they are creating a lot of content for Instagram and TikTok, short form video and other kinds of messages, trying to surface this content and engage with audiences where they are, where they spend a lot of their time. And we found in recruiting a set of participants in Minnesota who did use Instagram regularly, but had not previously followed NPR News. We had a treatment and control group. The treatment group was asked to follow NPR over the course of the election, and they were significantly more trusting towards the organization at the end of the study compared to the control group. And so we do think part of what's going on there is a decline in people who said they just weren't familiar enough with the organization to know whether they could trust them. So again, thinking back on this notion of selective trust, a lot of it comes down to a sense of familiarity and connection. And so we do think being in these spaces is an important strategy for building trust with that more indifferent audience. And lastly, I've been looking at the role of artificial intelligence, and this is more thinking in terms of how do you maintain trust in an environment that's only becoming more and more challenging for news organizations, where people are more and more conditioned to expect news media in general to be using these artificial intelligence tools to generate what is, for many people, a signal of lack of trust or lack of trustworthiness. How do you disclose where AI may be used by news organizations for things like translation or transcription or investigative work in data journalism that actually help to augment and improve the journalism? But how do you disclose your use in a way that doesn't just reflexively cause audiences to be distrusting? I've been working with the Poynter Institute in Florida and an organization called Trusting News, which has been working on trying to think through how do you disclose the use of these tools in a way that is not simply eroding trust in an environment where, frankly, people are becoming more and more conditioned to expect information they're encountering to be generated with AI. So that's the third area of my research these days. Finally, I think one of the messages I try to emphasize to news organizations that often want to know, what do we do about how do we respond to this erosion of trust that we're seeing in our own communities? And I think it comes with starting with thinking about who you actually want to build trust with. Are your goals around building trust as a means to an end? For many organizations, there's a sort of existential concern about getting people to subscribe and pay for news, in which case often the strategy is around deepening trust with people who already have some trust in the organization versus trying to broaden trust with people who are generally untrusting, people who are less engaged with news altogether. And I think there's a goal of building trust as an end in itself, where what we require is a broad base of trust across much of the public who are otherwise likely to be distrusted, likely to throw up their hands and say, I can't trust anything. There are different strategies to try to reach and broaden trust in that way versus trying to deepen trust with people who are already quite trusting of you. And so I think this is a core decision every newsroom has to be thinking through, but also as people who are interested in the subject to be thinking about the difference between these things because they're not necessarily the same strategies in terms of how to respond. And I'll just close with a quote from a Indian journalist who was part of one of our focus groups that we held around with journalists about these subjects. And he said this, and he has to be anonymous given the challenging environment that he works in. He said, are you going to try and build trust with that bunch of people who are regularly trolling you online or attacking you online? No, I don't want to build trust with such people. And he's talking about these most vehemently hostile critics of news. Who do you want to build trust with? Today's market, it's impossible to build trust with every reader, and you must draw boundaries. And I think this is a realistic attitude. What my concern is, if every news organization is thinking in these terms, and I think many of them are, they're trying to build trust with the already highly engaged, already somewhat trusting audience. That leaves a lot of the public who are indifferent towards news, who many news organizations are not even necessarily trying to build trust with. And I think that does capture a lot of what's happening in the current environment, that there's a growing segment of the public for whom many news organizations are not even trying to engage with. So I will leave things there and stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Well, thank you. That was great. We did have someone ask if you could please show the slide with the 4 key findings again.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. People can kind of chew on that a little bit while they listen to our Q&A session. Okay, so we had a couple questions just about the methodology that you used. How did you select and find the people who made up the audiences, and were they polled in person or online?
So it depended on the study because we had multiple stages of data collection. In general, with the surveys we conducted, they were representative to the best of our ability for all 4 countries. So we worked with survey firms that tried to achieve a representative sample. In our last 2 years, we worked with a survey firm that allowed us to survey people offline as well as online, which was particularly important for countries like India, especially, but India and Brazil, where internet penetration is lower. The surveys were online only in the US and the UK. So to some degree, we are missing segments of the public who we know are not online in those countries. But and then they were in multiple languages as well. So in the US, we in all three years of the survey data collection, we included Spanish as a second language. But obviously, if you didn't speak Spanish or English, you would not be able to participate in the study. In India, I think we had, I want to say, a dozen or so languages that were included in the study to try to make sure we achieved something approximating a representative sample. India is a particularly challenging country to collect a representative survey in, given the wide variation across that country. And so we also were, I think, selective about a broad range of different regions in which the survey sampling was done. But we relied heavily on the expertise of the survey firms that we work with to try to achieve representative populations. For the qualitative data collection, we were a little bit more strategic in terms of the groups that we were trying to survey. In the first year of the qualitative data collection, we were using recruitment agency that was screening people for both who are either generally trusting of news or not trusting of news. In the second year, we were doing focus groups that were targeted around, or no, we were doing interviews in the second year targeted around people's use of digital platforms. So we were specifically screening for people who used Facebook regularly or used WhatsApp regularly in India and Brazil, or use Google regularly. And so they were not meant to be representative. They were meant to be related to people's digital habits. And in the third year, we were doing focus groups based around the specific marginalized, historically marginalized or underrepresented groups. So there was a little bit different focus for the qualitative work rather than trying to achieve representative samples.
Okay, thank you. It seems that people often determine what news to trust based on how the news media tells them to feel about the news that they're reporting. And was any of that part of your research? Not only that, but what the news organization chose to tell their viewer about. So which news was selected to be presented to the viewer? Were those two issues part of the research at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of so for people who are particularly engaged with news, who are more selectively trusting or are just highly interested in it, they tended to focus much more on these kinds of questions around, like, why are they framing the story in this way? Why do they choose to focus the story on this topic versus that topic? And I think that's one thing to keep in mind is there's a lot of people, a large segment of the public across these countries who are not necessarily thinking in those terms. They're just thinking in terms of, like, I don't see the value of news. They're more indifferent towards it in general. And so that there is, that's one thing to keep in mind. But it is true for people who are more engaged with news, and particularly people who are selectively trusting, who have particular sources that they do trust and those that they very much do not trust. It often comes down to these kinds of questions. And it is something we focus on. We wrote a paper looking at attitudes about impartial news and some of the things that are underlying people's concerns. And a lot of it comes down to their perceived motivations about the journalists and the newsroom. A lot of people have in their, they believe strongly, and they're in some cases right, that there are different kinds of agendas that are motivating why newsrooms and journalists choose to focus on the topics that they do and choose to frame stories the way they do, choose to interview the people that they do. And for many people, and we heard versions of this in all four countries, sometimes there was a little bit more emphasis on commercial agendas. In other places, it was largely political agendas that people thought were kind of lurking behind the surface. And in some cases, people weren't quite sure what the agenda was. They just felt like there was some hidden ulterior motive behind the coverage that they were seeing. And as I said, you know, some of this is based on reality. I think that particularly in some countries, there are very strong political agendas or commercial agendas that are shaping the decision making for newsrooms. Now, I think one of the challenges is I do think there's quite a lot of variation across outlets in terms of the degree to which this is true. And I think many individual journalists will say that this doesn't really capture the way their own newsrooms operate, that it's too simplistic a notion to say that they're sort of given instructions from their publisher or editor to write the story this way or to cover the story this way. And that's not quite the way that it plays out. But for many people, that is the concern. It is what is motivating the journalism to appear that they're seeing, and a lot of it is the sort of hidden decision making that's going on behind the scenes that a lot of people don't have access to. And I think this is why there is such an emphasis in the industry among wanting to be transparent, wanting to use sort of foregrounding more and more of that process to more people to try to as a source of building as a strategy for building trust. The challenge is that I think that only works with people who are already fairly engaged, who are both interested in that coverage, are interested in those sort of editorial details, as well as not necessarily going to be sort of reflexively dismissive of it.
We have a viewer who wants to know if you know where the phrase fake news originated, or is that simply a Trumpism?
It's not simply a Trumpism. I think it predates Trump for sure. Uh, Trump has, of course, popularized it in some ways, and became a kind of easy way to dismiss covers that you don't like. But it definitely predates him. I think that the sort of contemporary concerns about it are rooted in a couple of different factors going on. So it's partly political, partly information that politicians like Trump. But you see other politicians in other countries who've similarly embraced the term as a way to dismiss covers that they find sort of antagonistic or that they find as threatening in some way. But the other major source of concern over fake news is the digital environment we're in, where there is actually a lot of information that passes itself off as news or journalism, but doesn't really subscribe to the professional practices or professional norms and standards of the industry. And so there is, I think, growing concern, separate from anything to do with politics, from things that sort of appear as news but really aren't news in the way that we tend to think of underlying reporting and news gathering and journalistic process. But I can think of this. You don't have to go that far back to think about. I think Jon Stewart and The Daily Show would often refer to themselves as fake news back when it was part of the just simply comedy, and but it's been the term itself has been kind of weaponized by those who want to use it to dismiss covers that they don't like.
All right. I don't know when Fox News became a thing, this viewer asks, but does there seem to be a correlation between its appearance on the scene and the beginning of the decline of trust in the news?
So if I could go back to the earlier slides where I showed you the trend in the US, which the trend of declining trust goes back quite a ways before the arrival of Fox News, which I believe was in the late 90s, early 2000s is really when it grew its audience to be what it is today. And so that's a much more recent phenomenon actually than the overall trends that we're seeing in terms of declining trust. I will say, when you talk to a lot of Americans about what they distrust about news is, and this is partly a kind of ideological reaction, but it's partly the broader trend of disconnection from politics altogether. A lot of people think about news in terms of cable news. So the things they don't like about news is all the commentary, the sensationalism, the sense that people are just sort of arguing about politics all the time. And what they have in mind is cable news. And that's not just Fox News. I think it's Fox News maybe the best known example of it, but there's a sort of style of delivering news that people associate with contemporary news in this country. And again, that's very specific to this country. But that's one of the things that is very different from country to country, sort of what people's sort of reference category for news is. And there was a study a couple decades ago, or maybe 10, 15 years ago, that looked at one of the factors that is part of the decline in trust is that reference category that people have in mind for news has been changing over time. So when people were asked about trust in news in general in the 1970s, what they had in mind as far as what news was much more straightforward. It was, your local newspaper, the broadcast television channels, your local TV affiliates. That was news. And so as news has become much, much broader as a category, including cable news, but of course now social media and all the other sources of information we're seeing, when people are kind of thinking about news in general, it is a much wider category. And so some of the decline is tied to the broadening, and it's not just cable news, but the broadening of the overall environment. But that only explains one piece of it. It's part of what I said here. The changing media structures are a major factor, but it's intertwined with all these other factors as well.
Very, very interesting. Okay, one of the things you mentioned earlier on was that people in the US who disagreed with the president at the time of the surveys had low level of trust in the media. And in India, those who supported Modi had a high level of trust in the media, I think you said.
Yes.
Is the media in India, well, it's a democracy. I think they do have a free press, but is there a state-controlled news outlet in India that could explain some of that result?
There is it's not state controlled in the same way as it is in some countries, but it is critics of the Modi government will say, and some of whom participated in some of the roundtable discussions we had and interviews we did with journalists, they will say very explicitly that like the most dominant sources of news are very corrupt and are very much aligned with the Modi government. And so it's not direct state control, but there is a intertwining of the government with some of the most prominent sources of news in that country. And so there is, to some degree, that is part of the dynamic going on. And a quote I read at the end from one of the participants who works for a news organization that's there are some smaller outlets that are digital only that have are membership supported that tend to be critics of the Modi government. And some of them will say, they don't think that the high levels of trust in news in India is a good thing. They would like for much of the public in India to be less trusting of news in general. They want them to be more selectively trusting of their journalism, but they don't see trust in news in general as a positive. And I think that's one of the benefits of the international comparative approach of our study is you have this variation. It's a good reminder that we don't just want high levels of trust. We want people to be trusting for the right reasons. We can debate what those right reasons are, but it's, I think, selective trust that we think normatively people should have, not necessarily generalized trust overall.
I have two questions here that are kind of related, I think, so I'm going to try to mash them together. Someone says it seems to them that journalism doesn't wish to be impartial, as in the past, because they realize it's a way to change minds in ways that benefit the author's values. And then the second commentator says, do people actually want unbiased information, or do they really want to have their beliefs affirmed?
So on the second question, people will definitely say that they want impartial, objective news. Even people who say, they like to consume opinionated content, they like commentary, they appreciate it, that they'll say at the end of the day, what they really want from news is a level of impartiality and objectivity. And there's some survey data that the Reuters Institute has collected where they've asked people, do Would you rather get news with that is sort of aligned with your point of view, or has no point of view, or challenges your point of view? And I think it's generally at least pluralities, if not majorities, in most countries. In a pretty overwhelming way, people say that they want news with no point of view. So people actually say that that's what they're looking for.
Mm.
And they'll say the same in qualitative, in-depth interviews, where people will often say, they are looking for somebody, a journalist, who's going to sort of do their best faith effort to give you all sides of stories and let you make up your own mind. And I do think that people, even very opinionated people, are often looking for that. Now, there's a lot of differences in terms of like how people perceive whether you're doing a good job of that or not, and whether you feel like they're representing all sides, or whether they're mischaracterizing some of those perspectives. But I think there is more fundamental agreement about what people are at least in theory looking for from news. I would also say, in terms of the first question, I think most individual journalists in this country still very much want to live up to that standard. I don't think most reporters have abandoned that goal or that ideal. But I do think there is some truth to the reality of our current media environment, whether it's cable news or it's these digital spaces, where uh, opinionated voices, commentary, and extreme positions are the things that circulate most widely and get the most, the most likely to go viral, the most likely to get higher ratings. And so there are a lot of news organizations that are chasing after that audience in that way. And I think it gets the most attention. I think sometimes overshadows the journalism that is committed to, as best as possible, a process around trying to achieve a more objective understanding of the an accurate sense of of daily events. And I think that's part of the dynamic that we find ourselves in. Is I think that it is harder for people to feel like they're able to access that content, but I think there's still a lot of journalists who are committed to it and who are producing it.
Okay. One commentator here says, I'm curious whether people are able to concentrate long enough to engage in an increasingly complex world where many topics require systems thinking. Do you look at the quality and depth of content that people engage with?
That's a great question. In some other work I have, and I think that is people are conditioned to increasingly, as I say, younger people, especially, who are reliant on digital platforms for their encounters with news and their engagement with news. They're more and more conditioned to news being packaged in forms that fit those platforms. So, preferring news in 6-second long video clips rather than spending half an hour watching a broadcast. There are ways in which the current media structures are shaping people's expectations about how news should be packaged and how it should look. And so I do think that's contributing to it. I think in general, news consumption basically has always been very much a matter of habit and routine. And some of those habits and routines in the past involve more time and sort of like uh, there were different attention spans in general. Whether it was the amount of time people spent reading a print newspaper in the morning or afternoon, or the time they would spend watching a broadcast. And certainly people who, when you talk to younger audiences, they feel like that is old-fashioned, and they expect news to be packaged in a way that will fit into the sort of busy routines they have, and the digital routines and habits that they already where they're already spending their time. And so, yeah, I do think that that's a big part of the challenge in terms of how you meet audiences where they are, given those changing habits in terms of using media in general. And I do think that's part of what's contributing to the declines in trust.
Mm. How do you disentangle the trust in news over time from the change in the sources of news over time?
Yeah, it is challenging. And it's that study I mentioned before that tried to disentangle how much people's kind of reference category for news is different, as they actually asked in an experiment where they were more specific about the object of trust that you're asking about rather than news in general. And so they can sort of disentangle attitudes about sort of more conventional legacy forms of news today from the past, but also that it's only sort of getting you halfway there, because broadcast news today is not the same as it was in the 1970s, and so the actual content itself has also changed. That is a hard thing to factor in. We know it's partly what's going on, and the ways that we try to get at that is through, I'd say, through the qualitative interviews, when people are reflective about the sources of news that they're encountering today, those experiences with news. But I also think, as I started at the beginning of the talk, their experiences with news is only one piece of it's only one dimension of what people are really drawing on when it comes to trust. There's still also those preconceptions and the cues that people have about what news and journalism is, that are separate from those experiences. I think one of the other pieces, one of the other challenges is, like, as we have a much more varied media system, I think you can easily point to examples of news and journalism that are better, that are more rigorous, that are more in depth than ever before. And of course, a lot of sources of information that are the opposite. So you have much more variety in both directions compared to in the past, which does make it hard to characterize in a sort of general way whether news is trustworthy or not. And I think that's true for individuals who are asked about trust in surveys, as it is for researchers who are trying to characterize the environment itself.
Okay, boy, I have so many questions to ask you, and I have so little time, and I'm just dancing between them here. So I'm just wondering if you're free until dinner today. Um, so I wanted to ask you a question about accountability of journalists.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a question that the first Trump administration was estimated to have made 350,000 statements that were lies. And where is the press's accountability for calling these out?
This is where this is what's complicated about this is, I think, much of what we know about those misstatements or inaccuracies actually comes from journalism. It's journalists who are tracking this, who are reporting on it, who are in many cases correcting the record. I think often what the frustration is that there isn't enough attention, what people feel like is enough attention to these concerns, and that it gets eclipsed by all the other things that are in the news. And I think that is a real challenge in the environment. That's also by design. I think that the current administration and the Trump campaign during campaign selection season has been very effective at dominating attention from the public. And part of it's only partly about journalism, because it is also partly, a big part of this is the other media structures that are at play. They have way more ways of communicating directly with the public through, whether it's social media or it's through their own email lists, or it's through their own other channels to circumvent the mass media in a way that wasn't possible in the 1970s. So it is a very challenging environment for journalists to try to hold political leaders to account for making inaccurate statements for that reason. I think that I don't want to let them off the hook, because I think there's certainly ways in which the press has failed in these in their responsibilities in these ways. But I think you can also point to lots of ways in which the problem isn't necessarily a lack of attention to these issues. It's that it is easily overshadowed by many other things that are going on at the same time. And I think I think the reality is just journalists at every one of these news organizations do not have the same kind of gatekeeping power that they once did. And many people think that's a good thing. And that's the sort of pluralism piece of this. Like, we do live in a much more varied environment that isn't simply taking their cues as far as like what are the most important stories of the day from a small number of people who had the kind of decision-making power. And that's a positive and a negative. Yeah.
Okay, with just intense and great regret, I have to say that we're out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Toff, and thank you to the audience as always. I have so many outstanding questions from you today, and I am so sorry that I'm not able to ask even half of them. I apologize greatly about that. Thank you to the OLLI program and our sponsor, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Please join us next week when Dr. Christopher Pennell presents Cutting Edge Cancer Therapies. Thank you again for attending, and we'll see you next week.